How can joint ownership or a cohabitation agreement be structured to address important issues such as the division of expenses and responsibilities? That's number one. The distribution of property in the event of a breakup or death. I feel like we kind of touched on that earlier. And other matters that may arise during cohabitation.
The easy answer, luckily, is that it can be structured however you agree to it. The problem is making sure that you know what it is that has come up or what needs to be addressed to know what to agree to. And
Mm,
like we joked about earlier, people find a way to mess things up. People find a way to be unique in how they've digressed from what their understanding was. I think the most important thing that both a joint ownership and a cohabitation agreement that I draft anyway, I always try to impress upon whoever I'm representing that the most important thing isn't whether you're A or you're B, whether you get or whether you give, is that both parties know what the rule is. And what I mean by that is one of the hardest cases that I've had in my life, and not hardest emotionally or anything like that, but just mentally and time suckingly detail oriented and miserable, was a suit for partition between two people that were in a relationship and then were no longer in a relationship. They started, as everyone does, sharing expenses equally. It eventually went down the same path that most people in a cohabitation agreement do of, hey, honey, I'm on hard times, or I just bought a new car, or you've got a promotion. How about I do the groceries, I'll take over the bills, and I'll take care of the car payment, and then you take over the mortgage. Well, when you do that, objectively speaking, to pull back the camera and look at what's going on from a documented financial perspective, you go from I'm paying half of what the mortgage is, I'm paying half of what the insurance is, I'm paying half of what the taxes are, to now you're paying all of it. And you're the only one that has a record of paying all of it. And I'm paying all the grocery bills. And whether it's right or wrong, whether or not we agreed to that or not, when we have a lawsuit that says I want my equity out of the house, if it ends poorly, you're going to say, this bum stopped paying payments for the mortgage in 2016, and for 7 years now, I've had to cover that half of the mortgage payment, and I deserve to get reimbursed it. And I'm going to say, no, that's not what our agreement was. I covered all of the utilities and the grocery bill. And so what was a good intention start of 50-50 with a good intention but miseducated shift to utilities and mortgage, because it's all seen in the bucket of, monthly expenses, now has become something where you're paying me $3.75 an hour to go through your bank statements from 7 years ago to add up what your grocery bills are, to try and deduct that and credit it against whatever the mortgage payments were. And by having that rule that I put in my cohabitation agreements of, if a mortgage payment is made, unless it is explicitly agreed to in writing between the parties, it is presumed to be made for both parties equally, or pro rata, however you decide. But by making a hardline rule that if it's paid for both of us, it keeps us from having these oral side deals, because an
mm,
oral agreement is worth the paper it's not written on. And so don't come to me talking about what was said unless you're willing to pay the money to bring in every witness that heard it to talk to a judge in the hopes that they believe you. Put it in writing first. First rule of anything legal is put it in writing. Writing can be an email, preferably not a text, but text is better than nothing. So um, I kind of digressed down the question and the answer that you asked because I wanted to get on my soapbox about that one issue. But I will tell you that issue is what has made me really champion cohabitation agreements, because that case was so painful for everybody. The other attorney was fine, and we worked to try and get it done, but it just, the emotions were so high because everything was for the taking. And so by taking this and putting it here, we can narrow the issues so that if there are disagreements, and I don't think a cohabitation agreement can be airtight, but it can at least narrow things down to where you're not paying me $25,000 to figure out who gets $50,000 in equity, because that's a waste for everybody involved. And so by apportioning out those responsibilities, whatever they are, it gives you that certainty on the back end that you're making a good investment. And what's your best case scenario? Your best case scenario is you go through this whole exercise, you have some good conversations, and then everything turns out okay and you never need it. It's like an insurance policy that never gets called upon. And if that's the worst case or the best case scenario, then great for you.
Wow. We are emotional and irrational creatures from time to time, aren't we?
Correct. If you don't mind, I think that you'd ask me some questions about breakup or death. I know we talked about breakup. Death, if I can just finish to answer your question completely now that I'm off my soapbox, um, a cohabitation agreement's not a will.
Mm.
And unless you choose to own the property as a joint tenant with right of survivorship, then your interest in the property will be owned as a joint tenant in common. Those are legal terms. What that means is a joint tenant with a right of survivorship is an election you have to make. It allows for two joint owners of a property to have their interest in the property automatically go to the other owner upon their death. It's
Mm.
probably not appropriate for people that aren't married, just unless you don't want your parents or your kids or whoever else to have it. That being said, I know plenty of people who don't want their parents to get whatever equity they have in the house, so it may be appropriate. But if you don't have that right of survivorship language, and title companies, when you close and purchase a house, will not let you start your title as owning it with a joint tenant with a right of survivorship. You have to get to a lawyer after the close. The default is tenant in commons. And that means that when I die, my one half interest goes either under the terms of my will or under the terms of the Texas probate code, yet another statute and code that's very boring. Um, Judge Herman in Travis County actually has a wonderful PDF chart that I think could be included with this that talks about the ownership of real estate when you're unmarried uh, and how that goes. And I call it the bouncing ball. It goes
Mm.
down to your kids, up to your parents, and if they're both deceased, down to your siblings. And if there's no siblings, then it goes up to your aunts and grandparents, and I think down to the aunts and uncles.
Mm.
But that is how your assets go. Simple estate planning can save everyone that you leave behind some headache and heartache. But the cohabitation agreement, because it is not something that has to be admitted to probate, and because we don't want it to have two witnesses and a notary and signatures and initials and on every single page, is not the appropriate vehicle to do your estate planning for. But that's how you do address what goes on with your property, and it's a question that you probably need to have answered so that you know what happens to the house whenever you're done with it.